There is no such thing as a bad question, but there are bad decisions. And that's especially true when buying your first synth. Today we're looking at the top 10 mistakes people make when buying their first synth. Our goal is to make you a more informed buyer so you don't have to learn the hard way. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music tech related. And today we're looking at the top 10 mistakes people make when they buy their first synthesizer. And I hope to have a little fun during this segment because I have made all of these mistakes. So if you've made one of these already, don't feel bad. I'm just sharing this to hopefully minimize the pain in your own synthesizer journey. So number one, let's start with the number one mistake people make when they're buying a synthesizer. The number one mistake people make is they buy a keyboard instead of a synthesizer. I saw someone on a forum the other day that was asking if this was a good synthesizer that they had just bought. And while this is a very cool unit, it's a PSS A50 from Yamaha, it is not a synthesizer. And it would be very disappointing to think that this was someone's first step in a synthesis journey. It doesn't really have any sonic sculpting capabilities. And really, there's a continuum, synthesizers often have keyboards, but there's a continuum that people with electronic instruments that people get confused on. And so there's portable keyboards like the PSSA 50, there's digital pianos, there's workstations, and there's synthesizers. And the way I would my own interpretation of what a synthesizer is at its core is it's an instrument that is focused on sound design, sound synthesis. You are sculpting, you are creating a specific sound, whereas a digital piano is focused on recreating digitally the experience of playing on a piano. A workstation is really focused on giving you a ability to create a song or a jingle, or just to do it all in a single machine. And a portable keyboard is sometimes a mix between a digital piano and a workstation in a portable format. So that's really how I would describe the continuum, and people get really confused and they can waste a lot of time and money in that continuum. I grew up playing on a digital piano, a Clavinova, which I really loved and benefited from. It had the ability to record and play back, and that was workstation-like. But I was always frustrated in playing that I couldn't really dial the sounds in, and I conceptually didn't understand what a synthesizer was until I bought my first synth, which was a Juno DS, and it began to dawn on me that you could sculpt sounds. And it really wasn't even until the Juno 60 that I purchased a vintage Juno 60 shortly after, that the light went on in my head that, oh, this is what a synthesizer is. The Juno DS was even still more of a workstation than it was a traditional synthesizer. And so it really lit up my brain in how fun it was to sculpt across the set of controls a sound. And so really be careful that you buy the right instrument for what you're trying to do. Synthesizer might not be the right instrument, but if you want to get into sound design, I think a synthesizer is a great choice. Okay, let's move on to number two. Number two, don't buy a modular synthesizer. Just kidding. Number two, don't get caught up in the looks. Everybody's seen them, these awesome videos of people playing modular synthesizers, getting patch cables, moving them around, making these amazing soundscapes and crazy noises. And it's very tempting to be like, wow, that's what I want to do. But that journey is incredibly difficult, and it's a very high learning curve, and it's really not a great decision for most people just getting into synthesis, in my opinion. So be careful. That's an extreme example, and I think one that everyone can relate to that's looked at synthesizers and said, okay, what should I get? But be careful. There's the other common thing is you find a synthesizer that just looks beautiful. It lights up. It's got crazy, crazy knobs, crazy kind of colors as you play it. And it looks amazing. And it kind of blinds you to what it actually is and how it actually sounds. You can really easily get caught up in that. And it's not probably the best factor to use when you're deciding on a synthesizer for music making, unless your aesthetic is the end-all be-all of your music journey and the Instagram appeal or the stage appeal is the kind of one of your higher priorities. I'm not going to judge you if it is, but that's what I would say. Okay, on to number 3. Don't buy a modular synthesizer. Oh, sorry, I already said that. Number 3, complexity doesn't necessarily equal betterness. And it's not the right word, but same thing. It seems like it can be naturally appealing when a synthesizer has a ton of controls on the panel, or when the modular kind of matrix, you're moving around. It seems, wow, this is really what it means to synthesize, to make music. And that's not necessarily untrue, but when you're buying your first synthesizer, complexity can actually get in the way of actually learning how to synthesize. So an example for me personally is, I didn't put this footnote in, but between the Juno 60 and the Juno DS, I actually think it was a GI. I don't know why I said DS. I think Josh and I were talking about the DS. But it was a Juno GI, just to correct the record. But between those, I bought a Dave Smith Poly Evolver. And the Poly, I bought it because I had played on it at a NAMM show, and it just blew my mind sonically. It was like ear candy. It overwhelmed me how beautiful that instrument was. And I bought it for that reason. But at the time, I didn't know that much about synthesis. I really didn't know the terminology. I didn't understand it. And I didn't really learn that much from the Poly Evolver. I would tweak different things, but it had so many modulation capabilities. It had so many LFOs. It had such a complex sequencer that I mainly just used the presets and kind of modified them on the front panel in different ways. And it didn't really teach me about synthesis. And I think it got in the way of, with its complexity, of me being curious about it. I was like, that's just too much. You can judge me if you want, but that's the truth. And I think my point here is, with the Juno 60, it's a very simple, and the JU06A from Roller, they're very simple subtractive synths. And it's fairly easy to get your brain around it. It's intuitive, you play with it, and you begin to correlate what each, it's kind of like the Korg Minilog as well. They're simpler, and your brain can actually begin to learn about it. And intuitively, you can teach yourself. So complexity is not necessarily a good thing when buying your first synth. That's all that to say. That's what I'm trying to get across. So on to number 4. Number 4, not choosing on what type of synthesis you want to learn. There's a number of different types of synthesis, and you kind of need to familiarize yourself with each type to see which one is most appealing to you. So there's subtractive synthesis, there's additive synthesis, there's FM synthesis, there's wavetable synthesis. And it's important to listen to instruments that use each type of these different synthesis and decide which one is right for you. You can waste a lot of time by not being intentional with the type of synthesis you want to learn. So it's very common for people to buy a synth and not even know what type of synthesis is kind of internal to it. The Reface DX is a perfect example of that. It's a lot of people's first time synth, and it's a FM synthesis, which is more complicated than subtractive synthesis, which is found in synthesizers like the DeepMind 12 or the JU06A from Roland or the Korg Minilog. And each of those has their own kind of uniqueness and different kind of, it's a totally different way of thinking about sound design. So it's important to be intentional there. Otherwise, you can just not even be aware of what you're getting into. So that's all that I have for that. And on to number 5. Number 5, don't assume just because it's analog, it's better. Analog synthesizers are fantastic. I might even have a bias towards them, but they are also very limited. The reason synths went from analog to digital is that digital synthesizers are capable of a lot more sonically. They're capable of producing more realistic tones. They're also capable of producing weirder, crazier wave shapes. It's just you're limited with analog synth. This is sound design. There's a finite amount of things that you can do with it. It's more expensive generally, and it tends to be it's limited. And they're both great, and they both they're not exclusive of each other. It's just they're different pathways, and you really shouldn't be biased towards one or the other. You should really take a listen to ones that appeal to you sonically, and use that as a guiding path forward. So one example for me personally, recently, I really have enjoyed a lot of the Behringer recreation, analog recreations, and the Korg kind of budget analog synths, and I love Dave Smith instruments. And I was recently surprised by a couple instruments, the Op6 from Korg and the Novation Summit, at how inspiring and rich those instruments are. And they're just, it's like the sound design element in those instruments is you're doing sound design on top of incredibly complex patches that are underneath. And to me, that's really fun and exciting. And it's hard to explain. We did a video on the Op6, but I was totally blown away by how fun and how and magical sound design is on the Op6. And it's really a tribute to the power of its digital synthesis engine. It wouldn't be possible to do that with an analog synth engine. Same thing with the Novation Summit. It does have an analog filter, but the oscillators and a lot of the brain power inside of it is digital, and it's a magical synth. And I don't know how to, I've never found an analog synth that's completely analog that is as complex as either of those instruments. And so I think that speaks to the power of hybrid and digital synthesizers. The Polyevolver from Dave Smith that I own as well is a hybrid between analog and digital. And really, from what I've read, they did that because there's a lot of advantages to using digital oscillators, to using digital LFOs, that you can do more with them. It's just you can get more complex sounds. So don't discount it just because it's digital. Number 6, just because it's vintage doesn't mean it's better. I love vintage synths. They just inspire me. I think they are magical. There's a sense of, there's an aura that they have. It seems like they're living. It's like vintage guitars. I have a soft spot for it. But it's not probably the best thing to buy as your first synth. There's a fascination, and kind of people are enamored with synths like the Juno 60, and they're pretty freaking amazing, but really you can go a lot further for a lot less. And really we're living in kind of a golden age of synthesizers right now, with great digital emulations of classics, great analog recreations of classics, and also a whole bunch of new synthesizers that are way more advanced and offer way more than any analog synth, any vintage synth, or any vintage analog synth could offer you. So don't think that just because it's come out recently, or just because it's a clone, or just because it's a digital emulation, it's not going to be as good as buying a vintage piece of equipment. There's a lot of downsides there. Juno 60s, Juno 106, you're going to have to get them serviced, which is expensive. Things can be kind of off and wonky, and you just have to live with it. It's a whole different ballgame, and I wouldn't recommend it for someone buying their first synth. Number 7, they're not ready to buy a bunch of succulents. Just kidding. The actual number 7 is they buy a synth because it's hyped up. And I made the joke about succulents because it's almost like a meme that any video or any photo of someone playing a synthesizer on Instagram or TikTok or whatever is accompanied by cactuses succulents all around, hanging, in these beautiful patterns. And I have no idea why succulents and synthesizers have become kind of synonymous in marketing and on Instagram, but it's really easy to fall into fads. It's really easy to buy a synth because everybody online is showing pictures of them playing such instrument, or it's very easy to not want to buy an instrument because so many people, it's a cliched, like the Mini-Log, for instance, which I think is a great first-time synthesizer. If you ask a random form online, people, or if you post a picture of it, people will get annoyed and be like, oh, not another picture of XYZ instrument, where it's a really good choice and you should be happy and glad that you got it. And there's other synths that I see a ton of photos of and videos of, and I see people buy, like some of Moog's synths, which are super amazing and very cool. They're also very complex and not necessarily the best for beginners. And I see sometimes, and there's a ton of brand love for Moog, and rightly so. It's an employee-owned company. It's really, they're doing very cool things. But I see people get trapped into buying a synth that really is not a great beginner synth because they see so many guys and girls that are using these complex machines beautifully, and they're like, it's everywhere. It's like, oh, this must be a good beginner synth. The truth is, probably isn't. And the ones that are great are probably, people sometimes throw hate out there because, oh yeah, that's just another one of those things. But really, don't let hype, don't let Instagram influence you too much on what to buy. Make sure you get one that is right for you. Number 8, they don't spend time identifying their musical palette. So what do I mean by that? What I'm trying to say is that everyone has their own personal taste, and the easiest way to identify it, in my opinion, is to listen to the music that inspires you, that you enjoy hearing, and try to identify the era it came from and also the instruments that were used during that era, or used specifically in those songs and by those artists if you can. It gives you a really great starting point to investigate different synthesizers that might float your boat, so to speak. And even on a more basic level, when someone's buying a guitar, there's basic kind of sonic choices that you make. So, do you want an acoustic sound? Do you want an electric sound? Do you want classical acoustic sound versus a steel string sound? And most people can, if you're not super familiar with all the different types of synthesis and kind of tonalities, you can kind of get a sense that, use those more general terms, like, do you want a warmer sound, maybe more organic? That's probably analog. Do you want more complexity, layering, rich digital, wrong words, complexity, layering, kind of metallic, beat-like sounds, maybe FM, maybe digital. Try and descriptively articulate what you're looking for sonically. Use your sonic imagination, and that will help you narrow down to a few different synthesizers, and then go from there. Watch some videos, go into a store and play them. That's what I mean by identifying your sonic palette. I think that's way more important than people give credit to. Follow your ear. It'll never let you down when you're on this journey. Number 9, similar to number 8, but kind of a variation. People don't spend time identifying what type of player they are. And what I mean by that is, again, I'm going to use a guitar analogy, but are you a lead player? Do you like to play lead? So almost like a soloist. Are you a strummer? Do you like to just play chords? Are you more in the background, more ambient, more support role? Are you a bassist? Do you like to keep filling the low end and kind of make sure the bottom end of the kind of songs are in place? Are you an all-arounder where you're one-man band writing complex kind of ambient soundtrack, ethereal stuff? What is your intention when you're playing? What do you gravitate towards if you play another instrument? Use that as a lens to identify what instrument you should go after. So for a lead player or for someone that's a bassist, monophonic synths might be a better option than a polyphonic synth. For somebody that's really into kind of ambient soundscaping, you probably want to look at digital synthesis with a lot of oscillators and a lot of kind of bitimbrality where you can have multiple patches going at the same time. So it's really important to identify what your kind of character will be as a player so that you can, again, narrow down what you're looking for. So hopefully that makes sense. And finally, number 10. I said it before briefly, but I'm going to just reiterate it again. Trust your ear. You have to trust your ear. Nobody can tell you what synth is best for you. You need to listen and see what you're drawn to. The best guide in this entire process is going to be your ear and using that to kind of guide you. So I hope that makes sense. It's very helpful to go and get hands-on with a lot of these instruments, but there's actually so many good videos these days that you can really get a sense of it via headphones as well, if that's not an option. But my ear has never let me down. It's when I've gone against it and bought something because it was hyped or because someone said it was the best or because it was the most affordable or because it was vintage or because it was analog, and I went against my ear's intuition, it always let me down. So really your ear is going to be the best judge, and even if it takes you to a crazy place and makes you go in a crazy direction for your first synth or your second, third, fourth, you're going to be happier following it than anybody else's advice or any other factor, in my opinion. So that's the top 10 mistakes people make. Again, I've made them all, so no judgment if you've made some of them or if you're like, oh yeah, that's what I was about to do. Hopefully this prevents you from having to learn the hard way and wasting time or money on a synth that isn't right for you. Would love to hear your thoughts below on other mistakes that you see people make, or if you think that I was wrong on one of my points, please, again, I'd love to have a conversation about it. I think it's helpful. And thanks for watching. Again, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications if you haven't. If you want to talk more, find us at alamomusic.com. And thank you again for watching.